everybody, to this closing keynote session of the 2020 elections virtual series organized by the Human Rights Center and the School of Law at the University of Dayton. I'm Shelley Inglis, the Executive Director of the Human Rights Center, and over these 8 weeks, we've aimed to really raise awareness and increase knowledge about what's at stake in the upcoming elections 2020 and in our US democracy, and to promote widespread participation in the democratic process by the Dayton community. The issues addressed in this series, such as voter suppression, race and gender, campaign finance, redistricting, and technology, remain relevant even after November 3rd. So we encourage everyone joining us tonight to look at the videos of our past sessions, which are available on our University of Dayton Elections 2020 website. We are so honored to be joined tonight by Dayton's very own leader and alum of the University of Dayton, Mayor Nan Whaley, who will introduce the keynote speaker and moderate this conversation. Over to you, Mayor Whaley, and thanks again for your engagement.
Thank you, Shelley, and it's great to be here virtually on campus at the University of Dayton. Go Flyers! And I want to say how excited I am that you all have taken the time to have such terrific speakers like my friend Senator Sherrod Brown and then Charlie Booker from Kentucky, but you have saved the best for last with the smartest human I have ever met, the former mayor of South Bend, Pete Buttigieg. And as you all may know, Pete ran for president in last year, and I was very excited to be a part of that kickoff announcement. I tell folks all the time, I've been doing campaigns and working in elections for over 20 years. It, to this day, was the most special day I've ever been a part of because I could feel real energy around the message that Pete was delivering for our country. And so as a Heartland mayor and someone that can share some of the challenges and opportunities like he has in South Bend, I'm really excited about this conversation. And I know you all will have great questions, and I know you'll learn a lot because you don't hang out with Pete without learning a bit. So just to give you a little bit of background about his background overall, in addition to being mayor of South Bend, which is the most important thing I believe he's ever done, I know I'm a little biased, he's also a graduate of Harvard University and an Oxford Rhodes Scholar, and he enlisted in the United States Navy Reserve and became a lieutenant when he was deployed in Afghanistan in 2014. His most recent book is Trust, America's Best Chance. I suggest you all get a copy, and his previous book was terrific as well. They're great reads. He's an awesome writer. So if you have an opportunity and you enjoy this conversation, I hope you'll go grab the book and listen to his conversation. When I think we'll get into trust a little bit here too. I also am really honored to be friends with his husband, Chasten, who is incredibly entertaining, engaging. And I think Pete and I can both say that we both married up. And we're very lucky to have Pete here today. So please, I know you're all applauding in your den or in your living room. My friends from Dayton, my dear friend, Pete Buttigieg. Hey, Pete.
Hey, Nan, thanks for the kind word, and right back at you. I want to make sure everybody here knows how much regard I have for Nan Whaley's leadership. She's a great friend, a great leader. There's a reason why the mayors of America took a vote and decided we wanted her to be our leader as leader of the Conference of Mayors, but also just somebody who lives and breathes Dayton and I watched her educate people from around the country on Ohio, on the issues facing communities like hers and communities like mine, and really speaking for the industrial Midwest, the struggles, the opportunities that we have. And so there's honestly, there's not a lot that could get me on the line for an hour this close to the election besides a GOTV event. But Nan's encouragement to spend time with everyone here was enough for me to be really excited to accept the honor of being invited to address the University of Dayton. So thank you. And I'll be pretty brief by way of opening remarks because I'm excited for the conversation we might have. What I'll begin is to say that, the stakes of this election kind of defy description without lapsing into some kind of cliche. Every expression we have in English for moments like this, a fork in the road or the edge of a cliff or a defining moment or a no turning back kind of decision. no words that really characterize how decisive this is going to be. And that was true a year ago. Now, just in the months since I left the presidential campaign trail, we have seen the stakes grow exponentially. The compound crises, the crisis that the pandemic represents, of course, the moral reckoning over racial injustice in this country, the economic emergency that in some ways we might be underreacting to right now as a country. And I believe a global crisis of legitimacy around the US and the way we're perceived around the world, which, if not reversed, would not only be very harmful to American interests, but would be bad news for democracy itself. Which brings me to the other really critical thing going on right now, which is that we can no longer simply assume as a matter of course that each generation or each decade sees America more democratic and more representative than before. If anything, we have become less so. And this is happening at a moment when there is what some have described a democracy recession around the world in terms of falling back on our commitment to democracy. And I'm eager to dig in, perhaps during the discussion, on what democracy means and what defending democracy means in the context of the United States and our future. I'm totally convinced that the decade ahead, the 2020s, are going to be remembered as the deciding decade for the American project within the 21st century. That we are both lucky and unlucky enough to be living at one of those moments where the decisions we're about to make about how to get through these next few years also necessarily are decisions about nothing less than what our political and economic arrangements are going to be for the rest of our lives. And we can go in two very different directions. The bad news is we could very quickly go off that cliff, or whatever metaphor you want to use. We are not that far from being a country that is finally devoured by the force that has always been most likely to wreck our American project, which is white supremacy. We are not that far from being unable to really say that we're a democratic country with a straight face. We are not that far, matter of fact, already have seen indications that a future generation, my generation even, might see a lower life expectancy and lower economic prospects than our parents for the first time in American history. That could happen. And perhaps most urgently, we could live to see what failure on climate looks like. So that's the ghost of Christmas future, okay? But the good news is, this could, by the very same token, be the decade that sees America begin to realize a level of promise and achievement that we've not yet seen. Within our lifetimes, as a matter of fact, by the mid-2040s, we can expect that America will have no racial majority. And America by then will have had an opportunity to present something that we've really not seen at large scale yet in the world, which is a fully pluralistic, fully inclusive, and fully democratic society. If we actually delivered that, which again, we will either, in my opinion, we will either do or permanently fail to do in our lifetimes. If we deliver that, I think that will be as meaningful a contribution to humanity by America as 1776 was. It's that big of an opportunity. But of course, that falls back to choices that are going to be made in 2021, 2022. In the very near term, we're going to make choices about economic justice, about the democratic character of our country, about climate, about racial justice, and so on, that really are nothing less than locking us into some patterns that will go one way or the other. Those are the stakes to me in what's going on in 8 days. I shouldn't even say what's happening in 8 days, because it's happening now. It's not an election day. Election day is the last day of voting season, and voting season is on. Chasten just voted today at the County City Building in South Bend, and to my enormous envy, he managed to make off with one of those "I voted" stickers, which for some reason were not on hand when I went with my mother to vote a few days earlier. I saw people standing. Nan's got hers right there. Wonderful. I'm writing a very sharply worded letter to the editor about South Bend needing to get those stickers, because that's important. And you know, when I see the sorry, there's a question already popped into the chat that I'll just head off because I have the evidence of the answer. The question was whether Chasten delivered on what I can only assume he said something on social media about, which is rewarding himself with early voting donuts, and whether he shared them. So this is your answer right here.
Of course he shares.
Always. But, when I see those stickers, I can't help but think about my time in Afghanistan. I was there for an Afghan election day. And they have a very simple method for making sure you can't vote twice. They don't have quite the same mechanisms for voter registration that we do. So they put a kind of indelible ink on your finger. You dip your finger in a purple inkwell, and it takes a couple of days to wear off. And it's a way to establish that you voted and to establish that you voted once. During that election, the Taliban put out word in some villages that if they caught people having participated, if they saw people with those purple inked fingers, that they would cut them off or worse. And people did it anyway. They voted. And so when you think about what people go through around the world, and if you think about what people have gone through here in the United States to earn that right to vote, it's a reminder also of just how hard won and hard fought that power is. And it's on my mind because I know there are people out there deciding whether to vote. Maybe for some really understandable reasons of having witnessed only policy failure in their lifetimes and feeling cynical about the system. But the reality is our system's most elegant quality is its capacity to be made better if forced to by people speaking out. And the best way that they can speak out is through the ballot box, a way to authenticate everything we've been tweeting, everything we've been marching on, everything that we've been saying, and all the other ways that we can express what we care about. There's only one of those many ways that we express what we care about that by law, government and specifically elected officials are required to abide by. And that's our votes. That is the moment of maximum power that you have to actually do something about any of the things that people are fired up about. And those are the stakes in every election, but especially this one. The last thing I just want to talk about for a moment, and then I'm eager to get into the Q&A, is the question of trust. As Nan kindly reminded folks, I have a new book out on the subject, and it's on my mind going into election season because I think an election is an extraordinary exchange of trust. The system trusts us, the people, to make decisions about our leaders. An idea that it was a pretty radical proposition at the founding, even for the very limited circle of people who were counted as citizens back then. And in exchange, of course, we're placing enormous trust in those we choose to lead us. But it's the vote that makes sure that they work for us and not the other way around. We're in a crisis of trust as a country. People are reporting less trust in our institutions, less trust in each other. There's definitely less trust around the world in the US as a whole than at any point in, certainly in the post-war period, really in modern times. And that's very dangerous because our whole system rests on trust. Our economy rests on trust. Our democracy rests on the idea of trust. And we got to find ways to build that up. And that's going to take intention. But I also think it's possible for us to create a more trusted and trustworthy community and system. And again, our best entry point on how to do it, to turn a vicious cycle into a virtuous cycle, is through elections. It's through the vote, and it's through who we choose to lead us and why, and the message we send as we do it. So that's why we are witnessing something of unbelievable importance. And as painful as it is to live in the moment that we're in, it also means that there's no question that we're living in a historic season too. And I'll close with this, since I'm addressing a university community, and there are a lot of students who look, it's just cruel and unfair that you've been denied a lot of the experiences that ordinarily go this semester would go with being a student. But the other side of the coin is you are guaranteed, your generation is guaranteed to be one of enormous consequence. And that's part of what it means to be living in this difficult and even tortured moment, is that the things that you're part of, through voting, through your professional choices, through your advocacy and activism, all of it, they're going to add up to some decisions that historians will study when they're looking at whether America didn't quite make it through the 21st century, or as we hope, whether America in this moment set itself up to deliver something even greater than we ever had. So that's why we're here, and that's what's at stake. And that's why I think a conversation about democracy couldn't be more timely.
Well said as usual, Pete. I'm very excited. There are lots of themes that you put in and some interesting questions, as you mentioned on the chat. But let me let me just start a bit. When you announced running for president, I think folks would talk about, is Pete a moderate or a progressive? And I would always say back, well, there isn't any other candidate on the stage that is talking about getting rid of the Electoral College and changing the way that we look at the Supreme Court. And here we sit in October, and both of those issues seem to be running constantly in the conversation. And I thought, well, of course, Pete said this a while ago. Can you talk a little bit about what made you come to that conclusion so early, and then also how you think that is going to be moving forward, those two issues?
Yeah, so it really is about democracy. So seeing our court continue to move in a direction toward being more and more politicized. And we see it every time there's a vacancy, and we're seeing it now. Each vacancy becomes this ideological death match in the Senate. And, it's partly because of this grip of ideology that a sort of unholy coalition, I believe, has been formed around the current president by conservatives who have every reason, just as progressives do, to be horrified by a lot of his conduct and so many of his policies. But because of the way the courts have been politicized, it's led us to this point. And I just don't think we can go on like that. So what I proposed was that we consider what would be called a balanced bench, a way to reform the court, not just in terms of its size, but in terms of its makeup to ensure that it's not so political or partisan or ideological. And, that sounded like, I think it was funny. There was one group of people who thought that sounded just really wild and crazy and dangerous. And there was another group that just thought it was really boring because I was talking about structure and process. And I think now we're seeing why it's first of all, not so academic or arcane what we do about it, but also not so crazy. In fact, I'm thinking about this option in some ways. Might start calling it the Lincoln option, because Lincoln was the last person to redo the size of the court, unless you count Mitch McConnell, of course, changing the number of justices to 8 temporarily. Until they took power again.
Right.
So we've clearly got to do something to protect the body. And it's not about having justices who share our kind of political beliefs. I would want that too, but that's what winning elections is for. It's about making sure that it's less about anybody's ideology. When it came to the national popular vote, which I stood up for early and kind of a tough sell in places like New Hampshire, but I still talked about it because I believe it. It's just that everybody's vote ought to count the same, and we don't have that. And it's getting really hard for us to be leading the democratic world when just about any other democratic country can more seriously say than we do that it elects its leader based on the choice of the people. I remember in high school learning about the Electoral College and thinking, that's pretty screwy, but if it ever actually happened, if it ever actually overruled the American people, surely that would be the last we'd ever see of the Electoral College. It's happened twice since then. And the consequence of that is a kind of estrangement between the people and the president. And it has all kinds of weird effects. I actually think part of how this president got elected, even though he's only president because of the Electoral College, but I think part of how we got here is a more generalized feeling of frustration with the system writ large that motivated some people to just vote to burn it down. And he seemed like the guy holding the match, precisely because the system's not been democratic enough. And even though he's only going to make it worse, he's where he is partly because people correctly perceive that something is warped, something is twisted, and it creates a kind of cynicism that ironically allows people like him who have no interest in reforming it to grab onto power.
Right. And I think as we sit here tonight, 8 days before the election, the eve before they push through yet another Supreme Court candidate, and I think about 2015, in June of 2015, when the courts made the decision around gay marriage, and thinking that three I think Trump, right? He's had 3 Supreme Court nominees if they go through tonight, and how vastly different that court looks in 5 years. Are you worried about marriage equality and those issues as we talk about a completely new bench, basically?
Yeah, I am. I come to this as somebody whose marriage, the most important thing in my life, only exists by the grace of a single person margin on that court. And, we've already seen writings from 2 of the justices that seem to be signaling that they would want to put that decision back on the table. And the really sad thing is our country got better the day that decision was passed. It didn't just get better for people like me and Chasten who had the opportunity to get married. It just became a more inclusive and decent country. And as a country, I think we've moved forward. And by the way, there's a long way to go on equality, LGBTQ equality. But we moved on from that question in a way that was healthy, only to find it being thrown back at us. And I do think it's in danger. Now, they may not go back and just say, oops, we're switching this decision. It's going to be more complicated than that. But I do see a world where they say, maybe they do it under the guise of religious exceptions, and move away from this, what I think is the right doctrine on religious freedom, which is that we ferociously protect religious freedom up to the point where it involves any kind of harm or discrimination that uses religion as an excuse. And at that point, it's not legal and it's not constitutional. I don't know that that's the view of a majority of justices now. And so we could see a situation where, based on that or some other reasoning, they say, oh no, you're still married. You're definitely still married. We're not taking that away from you. But you can't be certain that you're going to have those hospital rights because, that might go against somebody's beliefs. Or no, you're totally still married, but you're not going to get equal treatment on taxes in these ways. Or, far be it from me to discriminate against your marriage, but here's all the ways it doesn't count anymore, which is, of course, the same thing. It's just more subtle. So that's the threat to marriage that I worry about. And there are threats, I think more kind of straightforward threats to a right to choose. Again, in a country where there are all kinds of sincerely held and very different and very passionate beliefs about this issue, but where there's a broad majority, almost a consensus, if not on what the choice ought to be, then on who gets to make the choice. And that's that's coming up for debate again in a way that we thought of as largely settled in this country. Voting rights not being talked about as much, maybe because they don't have the sizzle of the social issues, but arguably among the very most important things that are likely to come before this bench and this Supreme Court. And, the idea of so-called originalism, which basically holds that you've got to decode whatever was on the minds of the men who wrote this in the 18th century and then read the words exactly the way they do. Among other things, could plausibly be argued to mean that you'd need a constitutional amendment or women would be ineligible for the presidency and the vice presidency. Now, right. No originalists, self-professed originalists admit this. But if you kind of reconstruct the implications of their arguments, that's kind of where it points to say nothing of what it means for the rights of somebody like me.
Right. So a lot on the decision tonight that has been just jammed through as quickly as possible. It's incredibly frustrating. I want to pivot a little bit to this thought you brought in about the 2040s, no longer America being a majority country. And, my husband and I talk a lot about how we see rights moving forward. We take a step forward, much like we're talking about gay marriage, and then it seems like we then take steps back. We've seen this since the Civil War, right? Reconstruction, and then 2 steps back on the grand bargain, and then on and on and on in this zigzag sort of way. So take me through your thoughts. Joe, let's knock on wood for us and say Joe Biden is elected president in 8 days. What is I don't think it's done there. The next 20 years I think will be a pretty wild zigzag, right? Because of this kind of great opportunity. How do we move through that, and what are the kind of things we're going to have to do to keep trust or gain trust in our institutions and in our folks?
I think the most important thing will be to deliver quickly, and to take one example that's in part important in my party, in our party. Consider what happened with the Affordable Care Act. Now, this was an idea that, let's be honest, was originally invented by conservatives, came out of the Heritage Foundation,
right,
as a way to kind of respect market principles, but still deliver healthcare. Then a Democratic president said, all right, let's do it. And suddenly it was turned into, the road to, Soviet communism. And I remember being on the ballot in 2010 when it was a brutal issue to be a Democrat while the ACA was being debated. We were getting absolutely killed over it. By 2018, that same issue in some of those same places was a winning issue for my party. because it had been implemented and it turned out the policy worked. Not perfect and a lot we can do to build on it, but it worked for people. And so the same people who might have shown up at the town halls yelling at the members of Congress who were delivering it were now showing up at the town halls yelling at the members of Congress threatening to take it away. And I think about that a lot because I think that when you do deliver, and you've experienced this, Nan, in your success as mayor in Dayton, and we had a lot of experiences like this. When you have the receipts, right? When you said, look, just come along with me on this, and then you do it, and then it works, you got a much longer rope to go do something even more ambitious the next time around, and people will trust you to do that. Then you really got to deliver, right? But that's how you build that's how you build political capital in its best sense, and that's what I think needs to happen. And again, the good news is on the issues, most Americans already agree about what ought to happen. You don't have to be a diehard Democrat to think that wages ought to go up, that the wealthy ought to pay their fair share, that we got a lot of work to do on racial justice, to want to see childcare set up in a way that everybody can afford it, to insist that we move to tackle the opioid crisis in new ways. I mean, these are a lot of things that our party seems to be pushing more on, but honestly, maybe not among elected officials, but among people, there's a pretty strong majority for. So there has to be swift action that people can see and feel over time, so that, maybe you win some elections, you lose some elections, but there's a sense that there's no going back on that. And I think it'll be especially important to do that in ways that make this country less unequal, because I think it's in a very unequal country that the mistrust has a way of metastasizing. I mean, think about the generalized distrust of the establishment that I think has fed a distrust of expertise or experts that in turn has, I think, partly been why medical experts are not being believed or public health officials are not having their advice followed in a way that has had a very specific literal death toll in our country. That's not just because of the president, although I think the president is a big part of the problem. I think it's because of an atmosphere where people living in what they know to be a very unequal society, unequal in terms of wealth and in terms of status, therefore distrust anything that looks like it's part of the system, whatever that means to you. And it's something we've got to fix, not only to get through the pandemic, but because a very similar dynamic, I think, is at play when it comes to climate. So much depends on our being willing to make important changes based on phenomena we can't see with the naked eye, according to a picture of what's happening around us provided by scientists and experts. It's very similar in some ways. And so we've got to be ready to act on these things in a way that reinforces trust. The last thing I'll mention, and I write about this in the book some, I actually think something as unsexy as a fairer tax code will go a long way here. Because when people feel like when people know that the tax code is fair, you're going to feel at least a little bit better about investing in things collectively and supporting the kinds of investments in education, infrastructure, et cetera, that we need to be able to say government's doing a good job. And when government's doing a good job, then the case for shrinking or destroying successful government programs doesn't exist or is weaker. And there's more of a chance to deliver, which in turn builds confidence. So I think these are all things that need to be acted on with a high level of energy and ambition very quickly.
Yeah, it seems that trust also goes hand in hand with this idea of fairness, right? And so when systems are you trust them, then you believe they're fair. If they're unfair, then you don't trust them. When you decided to name this book and really work this book through trust, when did you decide that? Was there some moment, or was it just, the work that you've done over the past few years? What made you really decide to dig in on this issue? I think it's really a really important point, because that's what we keep on really coming back to. I don't trust the vaccine. I don't trust the election process. I don't trust my government. So what made you decide to really hone in on this point?
Well, I think a lot of it was realizing just how urgent it was that we do something about it because of the problems we face. The biggest problems on top of us right now, climate, pandemic, racial justice, any of them. One thing they have in common is fixing them will require cooperation. And cooperation depends on trust. And one of the things I could feel in my presidential campaign, and definitely in the months since it ended, is the consequence of this collapse in trust that is, by the way, very easy to measure. They've been asking certain survey questions about how much Americans trust the government to do the right thing or trust each other to do the right thing for 50 years. And you can look at the graph and it's just, more than 70% said you could trust the government in Washington. Even the way it's phrased sounds provocative today, but in the 50s, you could just innocently ask in a survey, as generally speaking, do you trust the government in Washington, D.C. to do the right thing most of the time? I mean, today it almost sounds like a push pull. More than 3/4 of Americans would say, yeah, sure, yeah. Now it's like 18%. So we're talking about political trust, social trust, you name it. There's been this swift fall. And then I was thinking about my own experiences in life, including the experience of being in the military and learning to trust my life to people I barely knew. All I knew about them was that they were American and they were wearing the same uniform that I was. Thinking about the exercise in trust that is running for president, where you're looking people in the eye and literally asking them to trust you with their life and with their livelihoods and with the well-being of everybody they love. And seeing how that plays out in the tiniest way as you go through life and in the deepest way in terms of how our democracy is built, I thought we've got to take a look at this and take a specific look at this because I didn't think we were talking about it enough or thinking about it enough. And it was during the months, I've never written a book this quickly and hope never to again. But
I know, I mean, it was like this timing, by the way, too. Whew.
Yeah, and I don't recommend trying to write that quickly, but I really wanted to come out before the election for this reason. Right. But even in the weeks that I was writing, the murder of George Floyd happened, the pandemic unfolded, and you saw more and more some of the reasons why this is so important. And I thought it was that much more pressing to offer some explanation and some evidence and some research on how we got here, and some ideas on how we could get somewhere better.
So this trust issue, as you said, over the decades it's been going down. What do you think the role of technology has played in that? I just watched The Social Dilemma, for example, the documentary out. And what role do you think that plays? Does it play a large role? Does it exacerbate it? I'm also quite amazed just like the number of people that actually talk to me about QAnon, for example. Do you think it's a big impact or not, or where do you think it plays into?
Yeah, I mean, look, some of this stuff has been around forever. I mentioned this in the book too. You can find conspiracy theories from the 18th century that are remarkably similar to some of the ones going around today. But here's what's different. First of all, the speed that information can move around in. Secondly, the relative innocence we all have about these forms of digital media. And what I mean by that is, if I'm walking down the street in the 1640s and you hand me a pamphlet and that pamphlet was printed on a printing press, I bet I would have been pretty impressed that you had a printing press. And just looking at it, I would have been like, oh, well, I should probably look at this. And then eventually, I mean, there's a whole saying, right? Don't believe everything you read, because we realize just because something got published doesn't mean it's true.
Right.
And, today, if I'm going through a newspaper, those ads that kind of look like a news story, but they're not. And if you look for like a second, you realize, oh, this is a full page ad, not a news story. You can just kind of tell. We don't have that for digital information or misinformation. At least we're not as good at it. We just haven't evolved the kind of pattern recognition, really, as a species that we have on other forms of information. We're going to have to. And it comes with time, but we got to act fast. And that's why I think, yes, the social media companies need to be held accountable. Yes, there are policy issues here. Yes, there's responsibility, but also we got to be harder targets for this stuff and not just click on something that we're excited about because because maybe it reinforces something we agree with, or we get that little dopamine hit that they talk about in The Social Dilemma. Now, the other thing that's going on with social media is it tends to sort us and contribute to our polarization. And it's the algorithms are just spitting back to us what we are like, but in a certain way that's not good for us. One of the most important things, as you know, about cities, and by the way, one of the most important things about universities, is that at their best, they force people into encounters with ideas or people that they wouldn't have otherwise.
Right.
And the more our circles of belonging that we're in overlap, the better. If my faith community partly overlaps with my neighborhood, which partly overlaps with my soccer team, which partly overlaps with my political party, we get out of that overlap some shared sense of the reality we're in. But if you can tell based on my neighborhood and where I went to school and how much money I make and my race, what my political ideology and voting habits will be, then our circles are no longer overlapping, they're concentric. And that's something that social media can reinforce. So ironically, it's those technologies also have the potential to put us in places that are overlapping, but it doesn't just happen. The last thing I'll mention is that right now, unfortunately, there's a business interest in controversy. So these algorithms know that getting us fired up about things is better. I mean, yes, yes, cat videos circulate and go viral too, but often not as quick as one that makes your blood boil over politics. I wrote about a study of Russian misinformation that found that, I'm not talking about the election stuff. This was about vaccines. The same Russian bots pushed out pro-vaccine and anti-vaccine stories at the same time. Their purpose was just the controversy itself, because they knew it would undermine trust, and that had strategic value. And that's one of the great proof points for how important trust is how much effort our adversaries spend on undermining it here at home.
And this whole idea of polarization that we're talking about, that affects trust. There's a lot of questions in the chat about that. So this polarization then affects this trust issue even more because of that.
Yeah, because it moves us from our political disagreements just being things we think to being who we are. And that's the pattern. We've always had a lot of polarization in our politics on and off. You could argue the last 50 years were maybe the exception to the rule. But when it's this tied in with who we are, then it really does present a danger to our ability to hear each other. And it's why I'm such a big believer in anything that we can do to cut across that. I think great civic life does that. I think a great city design or neighborhood design can do that. I think that national service has the promise of doing that, just creating millions of voluntary opportunities to serve, kind of like I had in the military, but without having to go to war, where you get to know fellow Americans with different backgrounds. Anything that creates a touchstone of shared reality helps us when we do disagree about interests or values. At least we're doing it on the same field of fact. And that makes all the difference.
So I want to pivot a little bit more to just the presidential run, Pete. And I've never got to ask you these questions, so I'm kind of excited too that they were on the list. You were on the trail for yourself there about over a year, right? About a year and 4 months, I'd say. What was the most and you've been doing campaigns. You ran statewide in Indiana before, was a mayor. What was the most surprising thing to you? Was it? I'm not going to ask. I'll just leave it wide open. What was the thing that you were like, I had no idea, running for president would be this?
Well, in terms of my experience, I think I had no idea it would be as physical as it was. I mean, I'd heard the phrase like grueling campaign schedule, but you're like, how hard can it be? They fly you around. All you got to do is talk to people and shake hands and take pictures. It was physical. Like you just feel it every single day. And that's not to complain. It's a nice problem to have if you're a serious presidential candidate, but still, I mean, it'll really beat you up. It was amazing to me which things caught fire sometimes, because, for example, I knew that as the first serious elected official to seek the presidency, that would mean a lot to the LGBTQ community. And we knew from the get-go what that would, not what it would be like, but what it might entail.
Right.
I had no idea that talking pretty openly about my faith would touch the nerve that it did. It was just something I mentioned here and there. And next thing I knew, people were approaching me all the time to talk about what it meant to them that our campaign was speaking to a different faith perspective than what they were used to in the political space. So you just get educated all the time in terms of what fires people up. And then there were the issues, some issues you knew people were going to talk about all the time: healthcare, prescription drugs, gun violence. But one that really struck me was the gap between, on issues of mental health and addiction, the difference between how much I heard about it from voters and how little I was asked about it by reporters told me that there was a disconnect. And again, I know you've led on a lot of issues around addiction in particular and how they've affected Montgomery County and your community. It was really striking to see how an issue like that somehow just didn't command the attention that it ought to in the press, and yet is clearly on the minds of every family, every workplace. And finding those and then finding ways to express them and bring it out. That was one of the most rewarding things about the experience. The last thing I'll mention that was kind of encouraging, it sounds obvious, but it bears mention. every person involved in this process is a person. Like they're just people. And you realize that the most famous people or the most powerful people in the world, the people you're competing against and fighting, or the people who are at your side and are fighting for you or with you, are just human beings. And the sooner you kind of just grow into that and realize it, the simpler a lot of things get. I mean, the way it felt to be among the candidates waiting to go onto the debate stage is exactly how you might guess it would be at a very human level. A little awkward because we're all competing.
Yeah.
A little friendly because we're all Democrats. A little bit anxious because we're all fairly social people who are interested in other people and have a lot to talk about because we have shared interests, even though we're all competing. It's a very human thing. And even the moments, the flashpoints were very human. As is the alliance that I think we formed coming out of it. And if there's one, maybe the biggest surprise that I don't think pundits would have guessed a year ago, it's how unified our party and quite a few Democrats and quite a few Republicans and quite a few independents are. Well, all of the Democrats and quite a few Republicans on this shared political project that's emerged from it. Because back then there was all this hammering over how can this broad-based coalition possibly stay together long enough for November, right? And I'm sure there will be a tug of war that'll start right away should we win. And that's healthy. But look at what happened, right? And I think part of it is because there are people there who we like each other. Even when we were fighting, we like each other broadly. Right. And that was important.
So I mean, I see you all are doing the candidates are doing a ton for Biden now. Do you all still stay in touch with each other, or stay in touch more now that you're not competing, or how is that?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I just did an event with Cory Booker last night, supporting each other's political efforts. Amy Klobuchar kindly had a copy of the book Trust over her shoulder during a recent appearance. We're obviously doing all kinds of stuff with the VP and Kamala Harris. We're all part of this kind of video together a few days ago on our response to the debates. There's this very small group of people who have the shared experience of running for president. And even if we were competing when we did it, we now have that weird bond of having been through that together. And it creates, I think, a really special relationship that I think will be an important one across our party for many years to come.
I agree. I think it'll be something special and important. You've done a lot of work internationally, obviously, and paid great attention to it. And obviously, I think these past 4 years have done a pretty big disservice to our country when we think of our role internationally. As a matter of fact, anytime the president travels, I get more nervous than when he's in the country, frankly. How do you, again, I imagine us, we're doing everything we can. I'm going to be positive that Joe Biden wins in 8 days. How do we repair America's role to restore U.S. leadership in the world?
Yeah, so America's got to act fast because our credibility is at dangerous lows. I mean, there was one survey of world leaders that found, I think for the first time ever, that the president of China, the head of the Chinese Communist Party, is more trusted largely among our allies than the president of the United States. That is not just bad news for the United States and our security. That's bad news for democracy. And so the next president will have to work very quickly to restore U.S. credibility. One of the things I spent time on for the book was exactly this question of how do you get trust in a hurry? Because the thing about trust is it usually takes time. It's usually a function of repeated, credible, and transparent behavior over long periods of time. Predictability, which is not sexy and definitely not the president's thing, but predictability is a huge part of trust. But we don't have a long time. We don't have 50 years for the world to get to know the U.S. All over again. So the other thing I looked for, all right, how does it happen quicker than usual? And in the case of the U.S., the one time it happened much quicker than usual was around World War II and immediately afterwards. We got a century's worth of credibility and trust in about 5 years, not just by how we rose to the challenge of the war, but what we did afterwards and how we treated both our allies and those who were defeated. Don't get me wrong. We have always been imperfect in our actions around the world, but that was really something. And I'm bringing it up because we don't have anything quite like World War II going on, thank God, but we do have global emergencies where partners must come together and cooperate to defeat something that's going to harm people by the hundreds of millions. It's true of the pandemic. and it's true of climate. And so these are twin opportunities for the US to authentically lead. I mean, we have to actually mean it and we have to actually do it. But if we do, and we have to anyway for our interests,
Right.
if we do it right, we have a chance to get credibility in a hurry. The other thing I would talk about is, again, democracy. Our commitment to democracy is a little rickety right here at home. So we got to get our own house in order first. But as we do, I believe that it matters more than ever that the US be out there promoting democracy and democratic values, especially when you have competitors like Russia and China really working hard to export authoritarianism. And it's far from guaranteed that democracy wins out in that equation unless we're really pushing effectively. The good news is when we do that, it's always been America's strategic edge that even in countries whose regimes are not our friends, often the people quietly are rooting for us because democratic values aren't just American values, they're human values. And so it's really around our values as well as our interests that we've got to act. And when we do, we have a wonderful opportunity to solve big problems and earn the trust that comes with playing a leadership role in solving big problems. It's sort of the international equivalent of the way the Marine sitting next to me in my vehicle when we're going out on a road trip in Afghanistan learned to trust each other fast because we had to. That's where we're at as countries right now. And if we behave the right way, I think actually we have a once in a lifetime opportunity, if for some very scary reasons, to get that credibility together.
Yeah, I haven't really thought about the pandemic and climate change being these huge opportunities for us in the world, but you're right. And boy, do we need it here in our country as well. So it's a mutual benefit situation. So I'm going to ask one more question, and it's one that I find amazing. Is you are so popular on Fox News. Every time you're on Fox News, all of my Republican friends in Dayton say Pete should just stay on Fox News. He's so great. Is there something about Fox News for you, Pete, that it just feels so like you're ready to go, or are they not used to having Democrats on? What do you think it is that makes you a person that can take Fox News to a second?
Yeah, I think part of it is, look, what I have to say on Fox News is not that different than what I have to say on CNN or anywhere else I go.
Yeah, I watch him, Pete, and I'm like, yeah, that's right. But everybody's going on about it.
But there's always more tension on the string when you're at a place like Fox, because you know that these views that might be commonsensical to some viewers are not seen that way to Fox viewers or certainly Fox hosts. And so I think that's part of why I go. I don't have any illusions about that network, but if they're willing to have me on and I get a chance to lay out what I consider to be the facts and what I believe to be at stake, that's our chance to break through some of those polarizing boundaries that exist. And how can I be mad at somebody for not getting my viewpoint if they've literally never heard it? And I know there are a lot of people out there whose worldview is shaped by a handful of information sources that if those were my only sources of information, I might view things the exact same way. So all the more reason why I've got to mix it up. And, as long as they'll have me on, I'll keep doing it.
That's awesome. And I know you've had lots of folks that worked on your campaign that have gone on to do amazing things across the country and still working on campaigns. Is that something that makes you super proud of, like seeing just like the Pete fans that are like on the Senate races or on Biden?
Totally. We talked about winning the era, right? My organization now is called Win the Era. And we believe that because this was never just about getting me elected to one office. And so when my campaign came to an end, I was so proud to see the people who were part of it, volunteers, staff members. I think one of our strongest volunteers is on right now, actually, Eddie McCarthy, who was a student lead at UD and I know did a huge amount to spread the word and did a lot to make us proud. People who really just lived and breathed the values of our campaign. And are now carrying that forward in ways that are way bigger than any one person seeking any one office. That's the thing I'm proudest of, because I know that those people and those values will continue to spread, not just as I ask my supporters and followers to back the candidates I'm backing from Joe Biden on down, but just values that are going to help out in the world as we're trying to put together a better political life and a better civic life than we've had. And if we can get that right, that really is the project of a generation, and a project that's only beginning.
How many people have Win the Era endorsed so far?
So quite a few. In fact, I think we're over 50 now. You can go to wintheera.com to learn more about the candidates that I'm really excited about. And we're getting involved in some issue work too, some initiatives going on, everything from a popular vote initiative in Colorado to efforts to deliver justice and reenfranchisement to people who've been stripped of it by the criminal legal system. There's just so much exciting stuff going on. And anytime I can invite people who are drawn to my campaign, or what's exciting is, maybe you weren't part of my campaign, maybe you were something for somebody else, but together we might come together and work on this. It just fills my sails. I can't believe I'm old enough to say things like this, but seeing some of these younger candidates stepping up, these youngsters, it's really cool and really inspiring.
They're no longer the millennial. Think about me. I'm a Generation X. You're a millennial, and now you have the Zoomers.
Yeah, millennials aren't even the youngsters anymore. I got my students that I teach at Notre Dame who are they got a whole different outlook than I do, and it's exciting to see the leadership they're going to offer.
Well, we're excited for the folks that you've put forward here. Kyle Tromley also is a UD student that went and worked in Iowa for you. Now she's in Montana for Steve Bullock, and then the Ohio coordinated campaign director was your Iowa director,
yes.
Iowa field person, Jimmy, who's been
That's right.
Terrific. So just to let you know, there's some Ohio roots here that have been from Pete from the get-go. So they learned their best talents from you. So Pete, it's been a real pleasure to be with you and really appreciate you coming virtually to my alma mater. Give Chasten a big hug for me. Tell him I love him. I love you guys too, and thank you for this great conversation. I learned a lot and really enjoyed the time you took for us. I know how tough the schedule is right now, so it just means so much that you took this time for us to be here in Dayton.
Thanks, Todd. It's always good advice to do something you recommend doing, and I'm glad I did. This is a great conversation, and it's great seeing you, and thanks to the University of Dayton for hosting.
Great. Well, have a great one. We'll win in 8 days and see you on the other side.
Sounds good. See you there. Take care.
Great. Bye.